Good evening. Tonight, we are not discussing the future. We are discussing a deliberate amnesia. For 5 centuries, humanity was told a story that civilization began when European empires arrived on foreign shores, that progress followed conquest, that enlightenment came with colonization, that written language, structured governance, scientific inquiry were gifts from the civilized to the savage. But what if the story is not just incomplete? What if it is fundamentally, catastrophically false?
Because today, the same modern systems that dismissed indigenous civilizations as primitive are failing on every measurable front. Let us show you some of the data. Climate systems. Arctic loss is 13% every decade. 6 of 9 planetary boundaries are crossed. Mental health. Global depression rates are up to 27.6% since 2010. Youth suicide epidemic in developed nations is extremely shocking. Social cohesion. Trust in institutions at historic lows across 42 democracies. And an ecological collapse is going on in front of our eyes, with 68% of wildlife population decline since 1970. And yet, this is the paradox that defines our time. There exists a set of civilizations older than modern nation states that lived sustainably for thousands of years. They maintained ecological balance, preserved mental well being, sustained social trust across generations. How and why were they destroyed?
Tonight, we introduce you to a global alliance that challenges everything modernity assumed. The United Ancient Enlightened Indigenous Nations, UAN, an intergovernmental body uniting over 160 indigenous nations spanning the Amazon rainforest and Andean highlands, Aboriginal Australia and Pacific Islands, the forests of Central Africa and the Kalahari, the Arctic Sampi and Siberian tundra, the indigenous peoples of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and beyond. This is not a protest movement. This is not a cultural preservation society. This is a civilizational intervention. UAN exists not to negotiate with modern world, but to offer an alternative when the world collapses under the weight of its own contradictions.
As Indigenous nations, we are not seeking inclusion in a system designed to erase us. We are reclaiming sovereignty of our knowledge, our governance, our spiritual systems, and our relationship with the earth. This is not symbolic. The United Ancient Enlightened Indigenous Nations has a General Assembly with voting representatives, a Indigenous International Court of Justice, economic councils managing 500 billion in collective resources, and environmental protocols now adopted by more than 23 nation states. Health systems are documenting modern outcomes, modern medicine, which modern medicine cannot explain.
Tonight, we will show you the evidence, the science ignored, the civilization they tried to erase, and the future they cannot afford for you to imagine. Because when the ancients return, the future survives.
Modern science defines evolution through a single lens, and it begins here. Biological adaptation. Brains got bigger, hands become more dexterous, vocal cords defined, language complexity increased. Tools are much more advanced. This is what is Darwinian evolution, yet it is incomplete.
Because ancient Hindu and indigenous sciences argue that evolution has 3 dimensions, not just one. Physical evolution, what Darwin described, psychological evolution, emotional regulation, abstract thought and empathy, and conscious evolution, the systematic expansion of awareness itself. And here is what modern education never taught you. According to ancient Hindu cosmology, preserved in the Vedas and Upanishads, humanity has already completed the first 2 stages. The physical evolution peaked 10,000 years ago. Psychological evolution, the development of complex societies, art, philosophy, reached its apex in ancient civilizations. What remains is the superconscious breakthrough.
And modern science is catching up to the fact that we as human beings are infinitely potential, and human potential is not fixed, it is expandable. These techniques to expand human consciousness were never lost, they were actively suppressed. Colonial records are explicit about this. The British Raj in 1835 had explicitly recorded that traditional Hindu system of education produces individuals with mental capacities we cannot explain. We must replace it with English education to produce a class of clerks. The Spanish colonial decree in the 1570s had stated indigenous shamanic practices must be prohibited as they maintain social cohesion independent of their authority. And the Australian Aboriginal Protection Act from 1869 says the traditional initiation practices are hereby banned and children must be removed to missions for proper education. They did not ban these practices because they were primitive. They banned the practices because they worked. Because a population that can expand its own consciousness cannot be controlled. Because a civilization that understands the technology of inner transformation does not need an external authority to tell it how to live.
UAN is built on the premise that modern science is now only beginning to understand that the next phase of human evolution is not biological, it is not even psychological, it is conscious. And the indigenous world has been waiting through genocide, through erasure, through centuries of suppression to share that technology when humanity was ready to listen. The question is, are we ready now, or will we wait until the collapse is complete?
We were taught that human civilizations emerged independently, that the Egyptians, Mayans, Indus Valley, and Aboriginal Australians developed in isolation, coincidentally inventing similar technologies, similar spiritualities, similar governance structures. But the evidence, when you actually examine it, suggests something radically different. Not independent invention, but shared civilizational origin.
So let us show you what this means precisely. Case 1, Pacheyama and Pachamama. In the Andean civilization in Peru and Bolivia, Pachamama is Mother Earth goddess. It's central to the cosmology, and they offer cocoa leaves and chicha, and it's represented as nurturing but requiring reciprocal respect. And there are annual festivals timed to the agricultural cycles. Compare this with the Hindu civilization, where Pacheyamma is the green mother goddess. She is identical in cosmological function, and general offerings include betel leaf and rice. And again, it's the same reciprocal nature. And similarly, agricultural timings are time with festivals. Not similar. This is identical. The probability of linguistic convergence producing Pachemama and Pacheamal independently with identical meanings and ritual functions is very low.
And now, case study number 2. In Honduras, the ancient Mayan city of Copan contains temples dedicated to a deity that is in the figure of a monkey, revered as a protector, a warrior, a symbol of devotion and strength. The local indigenous communities who maintain unbroken oral traditions still worship this deity today. Now look at this. Hanuman from the Hindu epic Ramayana, the deity who is also a warrior in the figure of a monkey, who is revered as protector, a symbol of devotion and strength. This iconography is not just similar, it is parallel in every functional detail.
Now, case study number 3. Look at the Australian Aboriginal Hindu genetic markers. A 2016 genetic study published in Nature showed that Aboriginal Australian populations show genetic markers suggesting ancient contact with the South Asian populations. And this is seen as 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, which is predating records explored by recorded exploration by millennia.
And there are not just these cultural parallels. A few more are the fire rituals, the serpent cosmology, initiation rites involving seclusion, fasting, and visionary experiences, and among everything else, the elder based knowledge transmission system.
Now, case study number 4 is the African trance dances comparatively to the tantric frameworks. In Central Africa, the Bayaka people practiced trance dance for healing and spiritual communion. Researchers have documented that these practices use rhythmic drumming to induce higher states of consciousness, involve Kundalini-like energy concepts, feature chakra-equivalent energy center maps, and use sacred geometry in ritual space design. These are not metaphors. These are technical systems with precise methodologies preserved across continents.
In Siberia, the Evenki people perform fire rituals that mirror Vedic fire ceremonies, down to the mantras, the circular formations, and the offerings. In the Pacific Islands, navigational techniques use the knowledge of the astronomy identical to Hindu astronomy systems. And this all points back to the Rig Veda, composed many thousands of years ago, which stated, Ekam sat vipra bahuda vedanti. The truth is one, and yet sages call it by many names. This is not a philosophical nicety. This is civilizational memory. A memory of time when humanity shared a common knowledge system before fracturing, before conquests, and before erasure.
Modern archaeology is beginning to confirm what indigenous and oral traditions have always said, that there was a global civilizational network in deep antiquity, that knowledge systems were shared across nations, across continents, and all of these examples point to the same, that through maritime trade, migration, and spiritual exchange, these were not isolated primitive tribes, as according to the narratives of the colonial fabrication, to justify their domination.
The United Ancient Enlightened Indigenous Nations is founded on this realization. The ancient indigenous nations are not isolated cultures clinging to the past. They are custodians of a shared ancient human inheritance, an inheritance that predates empires, that survived genocide, that holds keys to problems that modernity cannot solve. And they are reclaiming that inheritance, not for themselves, but for all of us.
If indigenous civilizations were so advanced, if they held knowledge that modern science is now only validating, why were they destroyed? The answer is not complex. They stood in the way of the empire, not because they were weak, because they were structurally incompatible with colonization.
Historically, there have been framed a systematic 7-stage playbook for genocide, which can be mapped exactly to the indigenous genocide. Step 1, constructing the idea of the savage. Before physical conquest, ideological conquest was first. According to the Papal Bull of 1452, it said that it granted the colonizers full power to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other non-believers, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. The doctrine of discovery in 1493, where it stated that any person who is non-Christian have no property rights. Their lands were termed as terra nullius, nobody's land. This was not incidental racism. This was legal architecture. If indigenous people are not fully human, then their land can be taken without consent. Their governments have no legal standing. Their spiritual systems can be banned, and their children can be seized. All legally justified.
Step 2, invent racial hierarchy, the creation of scientific racism. Let's look at some of the examples. In phrenology of the 1800s, They took skull measurements to prove the European superiority. Social Darwinism is the misapplication of evolution to justify extermination as natural selection. Blood quantum laws in the US created legal definitions of Indianness designed to eliminate indigenous identity through intermarriage.
These were not fringe theories. They were taught in universities, published in peer-reviewed journals, and used to write laws. The entire apparatus of the objective science was weaponized to justify genocide.
And step 3, they stole land through law. Let's look at some of these examples. In the Indian Removal Act of 1830, there was a forced relocation of 60,000 indigenous people. 1/3 of them died in the Trail of Tears. In the Aboriginal Protection Act of 1869, the government became legal guardians of all Aboriginal people. They could control movement, employment, marriage, and removal of children. In the Colonial Land Acts, they declared that forest state property, criminalizing indigenous forest dwellers on their own ancestral lands. And in the Rubber Terror of in Congo in 1885, King Leopold's private colony instigated that villages that didn't meet rubber quota had hands cut off, and 10 million people were killed.
And the most insidious part, it was all legal, written into law, debated in parliaments, approved by courts. Genocide with paperwork.
Step 4, destroy the culture, control the future. In the Canadian residential schools in between 1876 and 1996, 150,000 children were forcibly removed from their families, beaten for speaking native languages, subjected to medical experiments, and some of the death rates in these schools were up to 40 to 60%.
In the Native American boarding schools in the USA that were established between 1879 to 1978, the official motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man." Over 367 boarding schools were operating, thousands of children died, burial sites are still being discovered in 2024.
And similar systems also were present in Australia, where the generation of Native Australian children were known as the stolen generation. Between 1905 and 1970s, 100,000 children were removed. Similarly, in Scandinavia, the Sami children were forced into Norwegian and Swedish schools, beaten for speaking their language. In New Zealand, the Maori language was nearly extinct by 1980s due to suppression.
Why target language? Because language carries worldview. The Sami language has 1,000 words for snow and ice, encoding environmental knowledge. Aboriginal languages contain songlines, oral maps, storing 40,000 years of ecological data. Destroy the language, you destroy the entire knowledge system. And the next step, step 5, is to criminalize the spiritual practices. The Native American Religious Freedom Act wasn't passed until 1978. Before that, the indigenous spiritual practices were federal crimes in the United States. One example is the Sundance ceremony, which was banned in 1883 until 1934, 51 years. In peyote, use in religious ceremonies was criminalized, and the potluck ceremonies in the Pacific Northwest were banned from 1885 to 1951 in Canada. In Australia, the Aboriginal initiation ceremonies were banned under various state laws until 1960s and 1970s.
And why were these ceremonies banned? Because ceremonies are social technologies. They maintain mental health without psychiatry. They resolve conflicts without police. They transfer knowledge without schools. They create community cohesion without state control. People who can heal themselves, govern themselves, educate themselves cannot be colonized.
Step number 6, extract everything of value. Let's look at the numbers. $45 trillion, conservative estimate of wealth extracted from the Hindu civilization during the British rule. $23 trillion, an estimated value of land and resources taken from indigenous people in the Americas. 46 million Native Americans killed through the colonial induced famines.
And 95% of the population has declined, indigenous population has declined in the Americas post contact with colonizers. And this is not just a history. Today, in the Amazon rainforest, indigenous lands are deforested for cattle and soy. In the Arctic, Sami reindeer herding is disrupted by mining and wind farms. In Australia, Aboriginal sacred sites are destroyed for iron ore. In North America, the pipeline construction has gone directly through protected lands. When indigenous leaders resist, they are eliminated and criminalized.
And step number 7, making genocide administrative. Modern genocide doesn't require armies. It just requires permits approved for projects to destroy indigenous lands, environmental impact studies that ignore indigenous input, and consultation that requires performance.
And legal attrition. In indigenous lands, they can claim that any indigenous land can be claimed in courts. Legal costs can make justice inaccessible, and by the time cases are won, resources are already extracted. Next is statistical erasure. Governments redefine who counts as indigenous. Census categories that make communities invisible, and funding is tied to population. So that excludes traditional residents.
In this way, genocide did not disappear. It went bureaucratic. It traded gas chambers for policy papers. It traded jackboots for court delays. It trades concentration camps for child welfare systems that still remove indigenous children at rates higher than any group. Currently, the statistics are still astonishing. In Canada, indigenous children make up 52.2% of foster care, but only 7% of child population. In Australia, the Aboriginal children are 10 times more likely to be in and out of home care. And in the Native American children in the USA are removed at 2 to 3 times the rate of other children. The system of erasure never stopped. They just became paperwork.
This is the context in which UAN has emerged, not as a reaction, as a reconstitution of sovereignty that was never legally extinguished, only violently suppressed.
We have established what was destroyed and how, but now let us show you what was lost, and more importantly, what needs to be reclaimed. Because when you compare indigenous government systems to modern state systems on measurable outcomes, the results are unambiguous. Indigenous systems outperform modern systems on virtually every environmental and social metric.
This is not romantic nostalgia. This is data. In indigenous managed lands, there is an absorption of 370 million tons of CO2 annually. Compare that with non-indigenous lands, which emit 270 million tons of CO2 annually.
This also means forests maintain dense canopy, rich soil carbon, and traditional practices of indigenous people enhance carbon storage. In non-indigenous lands, industrial logging, monoculture, and soil degradation still occurs. And this results in a net contribution to climate change. The difference is that indigenous management provides 640 million tons of carbon swing, relevant, equivalent to moving 140 million cars from the road annually.
And let's look at biodiversity protection. Indigenous people make up 5% of the global population, yet they protect 40% of global biodiversity in the territories they manage. And 80% of remaining biodiversity is found in indigenous territories. This is not coincidental. This is the result of thousands of years of sophisticated ecological knowledge applied through governance systems designed for long-term sustainability, not short-term profit.
In a California case study on wildlife prevention, the traditional indigenous practice was controlled and seen for low-intensity burns during the cool seasons in order to see the impact on removing understory fuel loads, promoting fire-resistant species, creating mosaic landscapes that stop fire spread, and enhancing biodiversity. The results were astonishing. Forest resilience to wildfire and minimal catastrophic damage for millennia was tested.
Compare that to colonial modern practices. Total fire suppression policy between the 1900s and to present has led to massive fuel accumulation, forest density beyond natural carrying capacity, and catastrophic megafires. Let's look at some of the statistics. In 2018, a campfire in Paradise, California, resulted in 85 deaths and 18,000 structures were destroyed. In 2020, it was a record fire season with 4.2 million acres burned in California alone. In 2021, between 2021 and 2023, there was a mega fire pattern continued.
The recent recognition of California partnering with indigenous communities to reintroduce cultural burning is a good sign for indigenous people, but it's not enough. Early results show the dramatic reduction in fire intensity and damage to threatened areas. But what could happen if more and more recognition like this happens? That is what United Ancient Indigenous Enlightened Nations is here for. And we can also see in food systems where indigenous polyculture is one of the best ways for agriculture.
So this includes corn, beans, squash are all planted together. Corn provides structure for beans. Beans fix nitrogen for corn and squash. Squash leaves shade soil and retains moisture. The result is sustainable yields for thousands of years without external inputs.
And when we see the modern industrial monoculture, single crop will cover massive areas and it will require synthetic fertilizers, which are usually petroleum based. It requires pesticides, killing out soil bacteria. Soil depletion happens within decades. And finally, the result is unsustainable, fossil fuel dependent, degrading soil at alarming rates.
But does it scale? Can indigenous feeding systems feed entire populations? Studies show that indigenous polyculture systems produce 20 to 60% more total nutrition per acre than monoculture when measuring total dietary needs, which includes proteins, vitamins, minerals, not just calories. And there's greater resilience to climate variability. No degradation over time and it can be practiced indefinitely. In industrial monoculture, there is high caloric yield in short term, but rapid soil depletion and dependence on unsustainable inputs. The conclusion, indigenous food systems are not only sustainable, they are more productive when measuring actual human nutrition rather than just commodity tonnage.
And we can see this across different areas of the indigenous knowledge systems, whether it comes to governance, whether it comes to family and relationships. Every single way, indigenous governance provides more solutions for modern challenges than we have ever seen, and we are not yet trying. At the center of the global indigenous resurgence stands KAILASA. It's not a new invention, not a modern construct trying to recreate the past, but the United Ancient Enlightened Indigenous Nations, unbroken in spiritual lineage and reconstituted in temporal form.
KAILASA is the revival of the ancient indigenous enlightenment-based civilization, a civilization that preserved consciousness sciences through unbroken guru-disciple lineages spanning thousands of years. They maintained temples as living universities, not historical monuments. They transmitted spiritual knowledge, spiritual technologies, which produced measurable, replicable results, and understood governance as a spiritual responsibility, not a power structure. They viewed Earth as a sacred living entity, not exploitable resource. And KAILASA exists only solely due to the tireless hard work of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, Bhagavan Sri Nityananda Parameshwaram.
Who is the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism? Recognized by more than 1008 Hindu pontiffs as a legitimate and spiritual and temporal authority of the Hindu civilization, and is the holder of multiple ancient lineages and inheritances, including the KAILASA, Kanchi Paramparagata, and the Mahanirvani Pita. All of these are ancient lineages, indigenous endangered lineages that have survived through genocide and have
been revived by the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism today.
This recognition is not symbolic. In Hindu civilization, the pontiff who is recognized by 1008 pontiffs represents validation across all major Hindu traditions and geographic regions, acknowledgement of spiritual realization and incarnationhood, authorization to transmit ancient sciences and establish institutions, and legitimacy to speak for Hindu civilization on global platforms.
What makes the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's work unique? This is a measurable spiritual science. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism does not teach belief systems alone. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism transmits experiential technologies. Let's look at the Third Eye Awakening. Participants who have experienced the Third Eye Awakening due to the initiation of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism have been able to experience seeing with their eyes blindfolded. They're able to read text, identify colors, navigate obstacles, and this has been documented in controlled settings and replicated hundreds of times. This is not magic. It is neurological activation of dormant capacities, which is possible only through initiation from an incarnation.
The other example is the Kundalini awakening, which is systematic activation of dormant energy systems described in ancient Hindu scriptures. These measurable changes in the autonomic nervous system, brain activity, energy field have been recorded by scientists during the experiments conducted by the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism. Participants reported expanded states of consciousness, enhanced intuition, and spontaneous spiritual healing.
Now let's look at the cellular memory, which has increased. There's been an access information stored in cellular structures beyond brain-based memory. People are able to experience past life and with verifiable test results. Healing of trauma, which has been stored at the cellular level.
And for the first time in modern day history, the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has documented and recorded cases of body levitation during deep meditative states, and the materialization that is continuously ongoing, so much of experimentation. Now, we know that viewers might be thinking that this is too extraordinary to be true. But we're not asking for you to believe. You can verify the results yourself.
Thousands have undergone these programs. Thousands have benefited from the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's initiations. They're doctors, lawyers, engineers. But now they have experienced the same science and the same healing, the same powerful initiations from the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism.
The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is among the only global healers and global leaders who have recognized that the persecution of the Hindu civilization is not alone to the Hindu civilization. It was a part of a global pattern, the systematic erasure of all indigenous Enlightenment-based civilizations. And the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism realized that the solution was not isolation, but alliance. And thus, KAILASA became the founding member of the United Ancient Enlightened Indigenous Nations.
UAN's founding principles are based on shared civilizational origin, the recognition that all indigenous nations preserve fragments of ancient shared knowledge systems, spiritual sovereignty, the right to practice and transmit spiritual sciences without any interference, and the knowledge and the protection of knowledge, preventing biopiracy and theft of traditional knowledge systems, self-governance, the right to govern according to traditional governance systems, economic justice, the restitution of centuries of resource extraction, cultural transmission, the right to educate children in traditional knowledge systems, environmental stewardship, which is among the one of the most important aspects of UAN, which is the recognition of Indigenous peoples as primary earth protectors.
KAILASA's role in the UAN is not domination, it's a catalyst. By demonstrating that an ancient Enlightenment civilization can be revived, recognized, and operationalized in the modern world, KAILASA provides a template. By preserving intact consciousness sciences, KAILASA offers technologies that benefit all humanity. By standing in spiritual solidarity with Indigenous nations worldwide, KAILASA challenges the colonial narrative that Indigenous civilizations are relegated to history. KAILASA proves that ancient can be made contemporaneous. The spiritual science can coexist with material technology, and that enlightenment-based governance is not utopian fantasy, but practical reality.
And perhaps the most important, KAILASA, under the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's guidance, demonstrates that individual spiritual transformation and collective civilizational transformation are inseparable. You cannot have an enlightened civilization without enlightened individuals, and enlightened individuals naturally create enlightened civilizations. This is the core of KAILASA. This is what was stolen, and this is what UAN seeks to restore, not just for Indigenous people, but for all of humanity.
So, what exactly is the UAN, the United Ancient Enlightened Indigenous Nations? Is it a symbolic cultural organization, a protest movement, a lobbying coalition? No. UAN is an intergovernmental body operating with sincerity, structure, and authority of a sovereign international organization. The UAN governance structure includes the General Assembly, with representatives from 160 Indigenous nations, with voting rights based on population and traditional territorial extent, consensus based on decision-making where possible, supermajority voting when needed, and annual convening with virtual sessions quarterly.
And an Indigenous International Court of Justice, which adjudicates disputes between member nations, reviews cases of genocide, cultural erasure, and land theft.
And the Economic Council and the Indigenous IMF coordinates sustainable development projects, establishes fair trade networks between Indigenous producers, and prevents exploitation by external corporations.
So let us clarify that economic figure. 500 billion is untapped Indigenous economic potential, which refers to traditional knowledge that currently generates billions in pharmaceutical revenues, none going to actual knowledge holders. Ecotourism, the potential on Indigenous lands managed sustainably. Carbon credits for forest preservation of up to 370 million tons of CO2 is absorbed annually, as we stated earlier. And sustainable resource management, generating long-term value versus extractive short-term exploitation. And lastly, cultural products, including art, music, crafts, often exploited without fair compensation.
The UAN economic framework ensures that we have intellectual property protection for traditional knowledge, fair compensation for use of Indigenous resources and knowledge, sustainable development under Indigenous control, and economic sovereignty, independent of exploitative external entities.
The Environmental Council also monitors ecological health of Indigenous territories, provides data demonstrating superior outcomes of Indigenous land management, and advises member nations on integrating traditional practices with modern technology, partners with climate scientists to document Indigenous climate adaptation strategies.
The Health and Healing Council of the UAN documents traditional medicinal systems, trains practitioners in endangered healing arts, establishes protocols preventing biopiracy of medicinal knowledge, integrates traditional and modern medicine where appropriate, and researches efficacy of traditional treatments using both Indigenous and Western methodologies.
And lastly, the Education and Knowledge Transmission Council, which develops curricula preserving traditional knowledge while meeting modern educational standards, establishes exchange programs between Indigenous nations, trains new generation of knowledge keepers, spiritual practitioners, and traditional artists, and documents endangered languages and knowledge systems. It creates educational materials teaching accurate Indigenous history globally.
Now, UAN is not seeking permission to exist, but it is engaging with existing international structures. The UAN has delegations presenting at the United Nations forums on Indigenous rights, climate, and biodiversity, advocating for reinforcement, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, signed by 144 nations, but largely unenforced. And also, the UAN is engaging bilaterally with governments willing to recognize Indigenous sovereignty, negotiating so many different reforms, and also collaborating to make sustainable Indigenous laws and protection of land.
And of course, UAN is also engaging NGOs and civil societies. There are partnerships with environmental organizations, collaborations with human rights groups, and of course, building public awareness and support.
The UAN is not asking for inclusion in the system that destroyed Indigenous civilizations. UAN is building civilizational structure where one operates according to Indigenous principles. It governs Indigenous territories, it manages Indigenous resources, it transmits Indigenous knowledge, administers Indigenous justice, and protects Indigenous rights.
This is not secession, this is not rebellion, this is reconstitution of sovereignties that were never legally extinguished, only suppressed.
Indigenous nations were sovereign before colonial powers arrived. Conquest does not equal legitimate transfer of sovereignty. Treaties signed under duress are void. Genocide does not extinguish legal rights. That is everything that UAN is emphasizing, and therefore Indigenous sovereignty continues.
Now, UAN represents, as we said, $500 billion in collective resources. It represents 40% of Earth's remaining biodiversity in territories it governs. It represents 370 million tons of CO2 sequestration annually. It represents more than 1,300 plus medicinal plants with untapped pharmaceutical potential. It represents thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about sustainable living. And most importantly, it represents humanity's best chance to survive the crises modernity has created.
Because here's the brutal mathematical reality. At current rates, rainforests are 90% destroyed by 2100. Coral reefs are functionally extinct by 2050. Topsoil has only 60 years of formable soil remaining. And we're at the tipping points of climate being crossed now. Modern systems are not solving these problems, they are accelerating them. Indigenous systems have already solved them. The question is whether we need Indigenous. The question is not whether we need Indigenous knowledge. The question is whether modern civilization will accept it in time.
So, understand, for 500 years, modernity has promised progress. It promised freedom through conquest. It promised prosperity through extraction. It promised enlightenment through the erasure of superstition. And what did it deliver?
A planet on fire, oceans turning acidic, species disappearing at extinction rates not seen since the dinosaurs, mental health epidemics in the wealthiest nations, children taking antidepressants before they can read, loneliness declared a public health crisis, trust in institutions collapsing, democracy giving way to autocracy, nation after nation. This is what modernity delivered. But modernity also promised that there was no alternative,
that this was the only path, that indigenous ways were beautiful but impractical, romantic but obsolete, worthy of museum displays but not governance. That promise was a lie.
Because the evidence is overwhelming. Indigenous civilizations were not primitive versions of modernity. They were sophisticated alternatives that modernity destroyed because they threatened its logic of domination. And those civilizations, against all odds, survived.
Think about what matters: 500 years of genocide, slavery, forced removal, boarding schools, cultural criminalization, languages banned, children stolen, elders murdered, and entire civilizations destroyed. And yet, the knowledge survived, the languages survived, the ceremonies survived, the spiritual sciences survived. Why? Because they were kept alive by people who endured unimaginable suffering to preserve them.
Because they knew. They knew that these knowledge systems were not just for themselves, they were for all of humanity. They knew the colonial powers would eventually destroy themselves. And they knew that when that collapse came, humanity would be
happening now, not in some distant future, now.
And in the moment of crisis, KAILASA and the UAN emerge, not as reactionaries, not as victims, but as civilizational alternatives, fully formed, operational, viable, and spiritually grounded.
So if you would like to be a part of the UAN, if you would like to contribute your time, talent, and treasure to the United Ancient Nations, become a part of this revival, you are welcome to scan the QR code on the screen below and understand you can become a part of the solution of the revival of ancient knowledge systems, which will help Earth survive, which will help humanity survive. So if you feel inclined, please do offer your time, talent, and treasure for the United Ancient Nations.
Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism and KAILASA continuously demonstrate that ancient Enlightenment sciences are not historical curiosities. They are living technologies capable of transforming individual consciousness and collective civilization. If we continue on this current path of extraction, domination, fragmentation, and collapse, or are we going to embrace the alternative of integration, regeneration, unity, and transformation? This is not about going backward. This is about going deeper, deeper into understanding what it means to be human, into our relationship with the earth, deeper into consciousness itself.
So I invite each and every one of you to become a part of the United Ancient Nations. You can visit ecitizen.info and learn more about how you can become a part of this revival. With this, we conclude our program for tonight, and I invite each one of you to visit and scan the QR code on the screen. Thank you and good night.